isn't a deal as it relates to the U.S.-China negotiations that we've talked about in prior episodes. This is a kind of a supplement to the U.S. tariff policy. So what this represents, it applies to U.S. domiciled semiconductor producers, mainly focused on AI specific chips. So Nvidia and AMD being the key subjects of this policy. And what it amounts to is any chip exports or GPU exports from these US essentially covered manufacturers into the Chinese market will get hit with a 15%, I don't know if a tariff is the right word, but call it a revenue share, right? And
The
so
word that came to my mind when I first saw this was tribute. But
tribute, yeah, yep. So if you're a US company and you want to maintain your US rule of law, all of that, the legal groundwork that applies to your business and its formation, all of that. And if you want to export into the Chinese market, prior to this, policy, Trump had opened these semiconductor exports back up in July. That probably had something to do with the discussions that had taken place in Geneva and London in prior months. But basically, now we've added on a policy. Hey, if you're going to do it, you're going to owe us 15%. When we say unprecedented, what this reminds me of is if you go back and read the book, The Prize by Daniel Yergin, the history of the energy, oil and gas markets, which we'll talk about in a second, the latest update on the oil glut, as Cameron showed in that first slide. This kind of reminds me of the rush by sovereign powers to get their revenue share of the oil trade in the first third, if you will, of the 20th century. It's kind of once the energy industry was developed, hydrocarbon industry was developed in the US, that's where we saw Standard Oil build up. Um, at some point between like the 1910s, and this went all the way into World War II and beyond, you started to see the development of the oil industry in foreign countries as the suppliers started to go search out, not just oil production kind of reserves and deposits in the US, which were mainly in Pennsylvania and Texas. They started to realize, hey, there's probably other supply sources elsewhere. That's kind of what we've seen the semiconductors kind of expand to over the last 75 years as that industry has developed. It's not just the U.S. anymore, and our third generation suppliers. You'd think of like Intel coming out of Fairchild Semiconductor, all of that, everything since 1950. Essentially, the U.S. Suppliers and production has now been offshored, and that's where you see, the story of Taiwan
TSMC, yeah.
Semiconductor, really TSM, yeah, accelerating after the global financial crisis of 2008, right? They've just eaten everybody's lunch in terms of the chip fabricators. I think you're seeing that same story on supply expanding outside of the US. So in this kind of context, the old energy majors, the first gen, Standard Oil, you had a couple others in the US, they export their production. And the version here was, hey, going after the major reserves that were being discovered in the Middle East and other places around the world. And it became a hot button issue for the sovereigns to get their share of the tax base of that oil and gas production, right? As you realize, there's consumption and economic activity taking place. What does the state naturally want to do? Well, it wants a piece of that. It wants to tax it to fund itself and the own growth of the state itself. So I think this is what you're kind of seeing here. the semiconductor trade is a growth. It is the growth industry, right? Or one of them, similar to what oil was from, Colonel Drake's first demonstration in Pennsylvania oil fields, right about, the Civil War era in the U.S. And then going into, I mean, oil and gas has been developing, on a growth curve ever since. I'd say semiconductors is kind of going through that same process, and it's reached the point where nation states are now kind of fighting over who's going to get their piece of the pie, and get a tax, revenue share, against the spoils from their own suppliers in the industry, if you will. So that whole process in oil and gas, as that industry globalized, was kind of in the World War One to World War II era. I think that's what we're going through right now with semiconductors in the information age.